Imagine setting sail to explore the riches of the East and ending up circling the entire globe, backward. This wasn't a grand plan or a heroic mission, it was a mistake. A massive, costly, and utterly baffling one. A single ship, small, weather-beaten, and off course, accidentally did what only a handful of legendary explorers had ever accomplished. And it didn't even mean to. What was supposed to be a routine voyage turned into a chaotic, near-fatal adventure that would unknowingly etch this ship's name into the pages of maritime history. Storms, starvation, enemy waters, and maps that made things worse instead of better. This is the story of how one of history's strangest voyages happened entirely by accident. And yes, it circumnavigated the globe. But the twist, it did it in reverse. Buckle up, because once this ship turns the wrong way, there's no turning back. The 16th century was the golden age of exploration, a time when the world still held secrets, and every map was more guesswork than gospel. Europe's greatest powers, like Spain and Portugal, raced to carve up the globe, fueled by promises of gold, spices, and glory. Navigators like Christopher Columbus had already stumbled across the New World, while Ferdinand Magellan's fleet, what was left of it, had stitched together the first known circumnavigation of Earth. But make no mistake, setting sail back then wasn't a bold Instagram moment. It was a gamble with death. Navigation was primitive. Compasses could mislead. Maps were often wrong, or worse, unfinished. Storms could wipe out entire fleets, diseases spread like wildfire below deck, and the open ocean might as well have been another planet. And if the sea didn't get you, rival navies or pirates probably would. It was in this chaotic era that our story begins, with a single modest ship built not for fame, but for trade. Constructed along the bustling docks of Spain, its owners were merchants, hoping to tap into the booming spice markets of Asia. They had no intention of rewriting history. Their goal was simple: follow established trade routes, make their fortune, and return home richer than when they left. But fortune, as they would soon learn, had other plans. A single miscalculation, or perhaps a series of them, was about to send this ship on a voyage no one could have predicted. One that would push its crew to the edge of survival and accidentally secure their place in the history books. When the ship slipped away from the Spanish port, its mission was as straightforward as any merchant's dream: reach the East Indies, trade for spices and silk, and return home laden with wealth. No grand exploration, no daring discoveries, just business. The planned route was well known, skimming along the coast of Africa, rounding the treacherous Cape of Good Hope, and then cutting across the vast Indian Ocean toward the riches of Asia. At the helm was Captain Diego Hernandez, an experienced but cautious sailor, known more for his reliability than any flair for adventure. His crew of about 50 men included seasoned sailors, a few merchants eager to protect their investments, and young deckhands looking to make a name, or at least some money, out at sea. Their cargo was modest but valuable: bolts of fine cloth, barrels of wine and oil, metal tools, all highly sought after in Eastern markets. In return, they hoped to bring back spices like pepper and cinnamon, silk, and perhaps a few luxuries rare in European cities. Everyone aboard expected a journey tough but manageable. 6 months at most, they figured, if the winds held, if the supplies lasted, and if fortune smiled. They stocked the ship with salted meat, hardtack biscuits, barrels of water, and enough optimism to fill the sails. But optimism, as they would soon learn, was not enough. Unknown to Captain Hernandez and his men, a perfect storm of navigational errors, unexpected currents, and brutal weather awaited them. A simple misstep would turn their well-planned route into a chaotic spiral that no one had dared, and no one had survived, before. The open sea was waiting, and it had other plans. The first few weeks at sea passed without incident. Good winds carried the ship south along the African coast, and spirits remained high. Captain Hernandez kept a steady hand on the course, trusting the same maps and charts that had guided countless others before him. But the seas, as always, had a cruel sense of humor. Off the coast of West Africa, a violent storm struck without warning. For 3 brutal days and nights, monstrous waves battered the ship. Masts groaned under the pressure, sails ripped apart like paper, and the crew fought desperately just to stay afloat. Visibility dropped to nothing, and their precious navigational instruments were either smashed or swept overboard. When the storm finally relented, the sea calmed, but something was wrong. Hernandez ordered the crew to reset their bearings, but with their tools destroyed and the stars hidden by thick clouds, they had little to guide them. Worse still, the maps they relied on were riddled with inaccuracies, distorted by centuries of guesswork and myth. At first, they believed they were still on track, heading eastward, but subtle clues hinted otherwise. Unfamiliar currents pulling them west, strange constellations appearing in the wrong parts of the sky. Weeks passed, and doubt crept in. Supplies began to dwindle, fresh water soured, morale plummeted. By the time the clouds cleared enough to take rough star readings, the grim truth emerged. They were nowhere near the Indian Ocean. Somehow, against every expectation, they had been pushed deep into the Atlantic and were still drifting west. Panic rippled through the crew. Some demanded to turn back immediately. Others insisted they press on in search of land, but with no clear idea of where they were or how far, they were trapped. Their carefully laid plans were gone. Now, there was only one goal left: survival. The ship's accidental odyssey had truly begun. With no way to retrace their steps and dwindling supplies, Captain Hernandez made a bold decision: sail westward and hope to find land before starvation claimed them all. What followed was less a voyage and more a desperate stumble across the world's oceans. Weeks later, a hazy coastline emerged: South America. They had landed somewhere along the jungled shores of Brazil. The crew, half-starved and delirious, stumbled onto land, bartering with indigenous tribes for food and fresh water. But they couldn't stay long. These waters were increasingly patrolled by Portuguese ships, and Spain's bitter rivalry with Portugal meant capture could mean death. Forced back to sea, the ship hugged the coastline southward, seeking a safer crossing. Against the screaming winds and icy seas, they rounded the brutal southern tip of the continent, what we now call Cape Horn. Few had ever braved it before, and fewer still had survived. Massive waves taller than buildings threatened to smash the battered vessel into splinters. Somehow, through sheer stubbornness, they made it through. Now, in the Pacific Ocean, an expanse even more unknown to Europeans than the Atlantic, their nightmare continued. Weeks stretched into months. Scurvy, the dreaded sailor's disease caused by vitamin deficiency, gnawed at their strength. Fresh water turned scarce once more. Fights broke out below deck. At least one mutiny attempt was violently put down. Yet somehow, the ship limped onward. They reached islands in the Pacific where they traded with indigenous peoples, sometimes peacefully, sometimes under threat. Their patched sails and ragged appearance told their story before a single word was spoken. Driven by desperation and survival instinct, Hernandez and his men continued westward, island hopping across the Pacific until, incredibly, they reached the shores of Asia. Instead of the planned eastward route around Africa, they had sailed west, across the entire world. By accident, by disaster, and by sheer force of will, this ship had begun a backward circumnavigation of the globe. And there was still one last stretch: surviving the long journey home, across the Indian Ocean and back around Africa. They were no longer merchants chasing fortune. They were survivors, writing an accidental chapter in the history of exploration. After nearly 3 grueling years at sea, the battered ship finally limped into a Spanish port, its sails shredded, its hull patched with whatever scraps the crew could find. Of the 50 men who had left, barely a dozen remained. They were skin and bone, their eyes hollow from years of starvation, disease, and loss. When news of their return spread, the reaction was confusion. This wasn't a triumphant trading fleet laden with riches. This was a ghost ship, crewed by survivors who claimed to have sailed around the world, the wrong way. At first, few believed their story. Maps didn't show the routes they described. The places they spoke of sounded like fantasy to those who had never seen beyond the edges of Europe's charts. But as the survivors shared their detailed accounts, describing the strange islands of the Pacific, the deadly storms of Cape Horn, the customs of distant lands, skepticism began to turn into astonishment. Over time, scholars and navigators realized the impossible had happened. These men had achieved one of the most difficult feats of exploration, and they had done it by sheer accident. They weren't hailed as heroes immediately. Some saw them as reckless fools, but history has a way of rebalancing things. Today, their voyage stands as a testament not just to human ambition, but to human survival when all odds say you shouldn't. In the years that followed, the accidental voyage of Captain Hernandez and his surviving crew found its place in the annals of history, though not with the same fanfare as Magellan's deliberate circumnavigation. Officially, records did acknowledge that their ship had completed a full journey around the globe, albeit by a path no sane navigator would have ever charted. More importantly, their incredible ordeal sparked urgent changes in naval exploration. Their testimonies exposed the glaring inaccuracies in contemporary maps and navigation practices. European powers, realizing just how little they truly knew about the world's oceans, poured resources into improving sea charts, star mapping, and shipbuilding techniques. Historians today view this voyage not merely as a fluke, but as a brutal reminder of the era's limitations and the boundless resilience of the human spirit. In many ways, these men achieved what was thought impossible, surviving the planet's deadliest waters with broken tools, fractured morale, and no clear plan. They didn't mean to make history, but sometimes history is written not by those who seek it, but by those who simply refuse to give up.